Okay, so now let's move to our next slide here and look at commodities. Okay, so we looked at a very sort of a basic definition of a commodity. So to understand what a commodity is in a capitalist context, we have to understand sort of two ways of thinking about commodities, and that is in use value and exchange value. So under capitalism, they have these two types of values, right? Use value, exchange value. The second one, as probably many of you might be suspecting, is more important to capitalism and really exists only in a capitalist society. Use value, all sort of objects and things that you could define as a commodity, the concept of use value predates a capitalist economy. And you'll start to understand why in a minute. So if we look at what use value is, it's the utility of something, of a commodity, right? The difference is qualitative. And it really only becomes a reality in consumption, right? It's not until you start using the commodity that you know if it has a use value, right? If you buy a pair of shoes, right? Its use value is not realized until you consume it, until you put them on and start using it, right? If you buy a meal, right? Its use value is not realized until you start consuming it, right? That it actually has use. It satisfies hunger. It allows you to walk outside in the case of shoes. So if we look at this, it's the material uses to which the object can actually be put, right? The human needs it fulfills. The value of a commodity in use value is measured by its usefulness or its utility. It is a qualitative difference. Does it do the thing that it is supposed to do? Now, exchange value refers to the value of a commodity in a marketplace, specifically its ability to be compared to other commodities. As we have here, a commodity is measured by its comparative value to other commodities. This represents a more abstract value, right? We are valuing a commodity in terms of money. It is a quantitative difference. That is the key difference. Use value is qualitative. Exchange value is quantitative. You have to be able to abstract and put a number on it. And this is key when you're comparing commodities, but especially two different commodities. So I'll try to give you a kind of concrete example to begin with. Okay? So if we look at watches, if we take a Rolex and a Timex, a Rolex is obviously something that most of us will never be able to afford. But in terms of their use value is actually the same, right? There is no real qualitative difference. Now you could argue, okay, yeah, there's a qualitative difference in terms of materials, but in terms of what its utility is, a Rolex and a Timex, a very expensive watch and a cheap watch, they have the same use value. Does it tell time, right? Both tells time. So their use value is identical. Qualitatively, there is no difference between what they are supposed to do, right? The need that it fulfills is identical. Now, of course, under exchange value, there is a big difference, right? A Rolex can cost upwards of $20,000 and a Timex can cost as less as $5 to $10, right? And part of the reason that exchange value is so different is the materials that go into making a Rolex. You're talking like gold, silver, possibly diamonds on the watch, right? None of which matter in terms of its use value. A diamond on a Rolex does not make it tell time more accurately, right? Versus plastic doesn't make a Timex tell time less accurately, right? That's the key difference here, right? The materials used in the manufacturing of a Rolex are much rarer, which means the labor time required to extract those materials is much more, which is why it has a greater value. And they're also probably handmade, right? Which means there's a lot more time and energy that goes into making it, whereas a Timex is industrially produced and it uses cheap materials, right? So its labor time is less, therefore it has less exchange value. This is also especially important when we are comparing and exchanging two different types of commodities. So for example, if we use kind of the classic example of like iron versus cloth, right? Well, how do you determine what their value is in terms of exchange? It has to be represented quantitatively, right? Their use value doesn't really help you, because the use value of cloth and the use value of iron is really uncomparable. But in a marketplace, you have to have an exchange value. You have to be able to put a number on it. And again, to determine that value, you have to figure out how much labor time actually went into producing that particular commodity. Now, of course, if we're going to try to find an equivalent value of iron to cloth, we're probably going to need a lot of cloth, right? to equal, say, a pound of iron, right? Put simply, that's basically how it works. Now, let's look at commodification. Now, commodification, put simply, is the transformation of goods, services, nature, ideas, social relations, people, information into objects for exchange, or an object of economic value. Another way to think of it, if we want to think of it more theoretically, is the subordination of both private and public realms to the logic of capitalism, specifically when something moves from merely a use value to an exchange value. As capitalism develops and expands, commodification expands. Right? In the phase of merchant capitalism, that is before capitalism expanded into production, most of the commodities we saw were very simple, right? Spices, that kind of thing, maybe some agricultural products, precious metals, right? What the Spanish were looking for, spices in terms of what the Portuguese were initially looking for, but they're not producing anything. So the commodification is very, very, there's sort of a low commodification, right? Because these are not capitalist societies. Capital, if it exists, existed on the margins of societies. But as capitalism expands, specifically as merchants get involved in production and capitalism expands into the realm of production, the amount of commodities expands and in many ways explodes with that, right? Labor becomes commodified. I'll talk more about that in a minute. Tools become commodified. Food becomes commodified initially, right? As Braverman himself says, in the reading on the universal market, he says, quote, industrial capitalism begins with a limited range of commodities in circulation. On the household level, these include basic foodstuffs in a more or less unprocessed form. Grains, fish, meats, dairy products, vegetables, distilled and fermented liquors, right? So that's a lot of what we mean by commodification. It's really when an object moves from use value to exchange value, it becomes commodified. It matters only in what its quantitative value is. So just to recap a little bit, right? First, commodities emerged in agriculture, right? And then it expands from there into other things. Now let's look at sugar as an example, right? And part of the reason sugar was so important was because it was connected to one of the first mass-produced products. So if we look specifically at sugar and tea and the commodification of sugar and tea and its role in capitalism, if we think about how that worked, right? Sugar was produced under slave conditions, right? But then it was exported back to, in this context, let's say England, right? And when it gets back to England, it is mixed with tea, caffeinated beverage. It's concentrated calories mixed with a caffeinated beverage. And in many ways, this early commodity, right, is what allowed the industrial process, or at least the capitalist mode of production, to really proceed, because it provided the sort of gasoline, if you will, for individual people to work the long hours that was required of them under the emerging capitalist and later industrial capitalist system, right? It was a commodity that was available to everybody in that sense. Okay, so that's just sort of one example. Now let's look at maybe an example that's a bit more abstract. The example that you looked at in the sort of E.P. Thompson piece, okay? Now, we're going to examine something here that is so fundamental that we don't really think of it. And we see this commodification at work in Thompson's piece, specifically how an immaterial concept such as time moves from a use value to an exchange value, right? And Thompson premises that article by saying, quote, this, said if the transition to mature industrial society entailed a severe restructuring of working habits, new disciplines, new incentives, and a new human nature upon which these incentives could build effectively, how far is this related to changes in the inward notion of time? Now, what Thompson is saying is how much of the emergence of capitalism, and specifically the commodification process, is really about thinking about time differently, okay? So if we look at this, Thompson basically says prior to industrial capitalism, people tended to think about time differently. We think about times in terms of a clock, right? How many seconds does it take? How many minutes does it take? How many hours? How many days? Right? Etc. Most of us think of time that way. But what Thompson says is prior to industrial capitalism or even commercial capitalism, people didn't think about time abstractly as represented by numbers. They thought about time much more concretely. They thought about it in terms of tasks or uses, right? It had more of a use value, right? So if we think about it this way, he talks about how in some societies, say in England, time was measured by, well, how if you were to ask how long something would take, you could say, well, as long as it takes to cook a pound of rice, right? Or the time it takes for maize or corn to be roasted, right? Now, what this meant was that time was just thought about differently. It was thought about more concretely, right? And he says basically there's a few points that we can sort of deduce and generalize as to how that society functioned, right? One was that labor as a task or a use value is more humanely comprehensible. It's not abstracted into exchange value. Second, the community in which the task orientation is common appears to show a less sort of a demarcation between work and life, right? Now, this is typical of the artisanal mode of production, if you think of it, right? It wasn't so much, when you think of work and life or work and leisure, they existed within the same kind of realm. A master craftsman owned, in this case, the workshop, right? But it was also part of the family, right? The production process and the workshop was indistinguishable from the family in this sense. So the line between work and life, or work and leisure, or work and play, or work and family was completely and utterly entangled. It was not a sort of distinct demarcation like we see in terms of capital, right? Today you go to work, you go home, right? You have work time, you have leisure time. And what that also means is that the way that a working day actually functioned was a little bit different. Right? The way that a working day actually functioned was that, well, when was work done? When all the tasks were finished, right? So the working day contracted and expanded based on the particular task that you're doing. If you go to a job today, you usually, if you're going to work 8 hours, you work 8 hours, right? If you finish a bunch of tasks, you don't say, well, I finished everything, I'm going to go home. Usually your boss or your supervisor or your employer will then find you something else to do. And we'll explain in a minute how that sort of happens. So what's key is that demarcation between work and life or leisure. That is key for the greater commodification of time, of labor, and then eventually leisure. So this marks a shift from the artisanal to the capitalist mode of production, right? And it happens largely because of a division of labor, right? You see it start to happen in the artisanal form of production, right? Whenever a master craftsman brings on an employee, right, things start to become a little bit more distinctive. It's not just his family that he's relying on, right? Even between fathers and sons, there could potentially be a division of labor between husband and wife, father and mother, right? So once you start dividing labor, and when you move out of that artisanal mode of production and you get a capitalist mode of production, right, where you get a division of labor, and I'll talk about the division of labor in greater detail in a minute, right? Time starts to become money. Right? Under a capitalist mode of production, time and money are effectively the same thing, right? That's how time is measured in terms of money. And again, I'll explain that when we look at labor specifically. Time now is not something that is past, but is something that is spent, right? Wage labor is now employed. Idle time is wasted money. If your workers are sitting around, well, you're paying them and they're not doing anything. They're not producing anything. And this leads to the third point that Thompson makes. A society or a people that are accustomed to labor time by a clock rather than a task, the attitude of time as task seems to be wasteful and lacking in urgency, right? Which makes sense because it's more difficult to exploit that labor. It is regarded as wasteful because it makes it difficult to commodify labor. So this is key. The commodification of time is key to the commodification of labor. When you get a job, right? And a lot of our, say, summer jobs that we had while I was in undergrad, or while you guys are still performing in undergrad, is measured in terms of time, right? When you go to a job if you work in food services, if you work in general labor, whatever your job is, right? You're probably paid by the hour, right? Time is measured in terms of money. How much do you get paid? $12 an hour. How much do you get paid? $15 an hour, right? Time and money become the same thing. So the commodification process, first and foremost, even though it begins with sort of foodstuffs, when you really get into a capitalist mode of production, it's the commodification of time that is thought of not in terms of what can you get done in this time, but how much can you put a numerical value on a particular demarcation of time. How much do you get paid an hour? How much do you get paid a day? How much do you get paid a week? How much do you get paid a month? How much do you get paid a year, right? Even when you get into salary, right? it's still measured in terms of time. Somebody that makes $70,000 a year, $100,000 a year, right? That year is the unit of time that is now given an exchanged value. And this is what we're talking about when we talk about commodification, and that exists in every other realm. Everything that you have is commodified. Every object that you own is probably a commodity. Now, this wasn't always the case, right? If we look at the history of capitalism, as Braverman said, it starts with a few commodities, and then it expands and expands and expands. And we'll talk about this more when we look at division of labor in a minute, and we look at eventually the market. But there is no limit to what can be commodified under capitalism. All right, I'll leave it there. Again, if you guys have questions, feel free to email me. The next video, we are going to look at labor, right? So we've looked at commodification, but now we're going to look at labor. And labor is a very interesting and distinct commodity for reasons that you've probably already guessed.